Now, something truly remarkable happened. Two distinct ways of surviving, the herders and the cereal farmers, came together. They each had half of the puzzle. The herders had the animals, while the farmers were growing grain to feed the stock. For the first time in history, a ready supply of meat was brought together with cereals. This must have been a challenging meeting. Herding and cultivating were very different ways of life. They both had to adapt. Below the huts, in the valley, was a community which was much larger and more prosperous. The difference here was made by the humble goat. These animals were really the catalyst for urban life as we know it today. People came together in large communities. Extended families could work together. They were now secure and could plan for the future. People and animals were crammed together. They created hygiene problems and new diseases. The pressure was on to organize, to keep everything apart. To do that, they needed new towns built in a new way. These new villages bustled with life. They had plenty of food. Now some people could be freed from the grind of farming. They developed their talents into specialized jobs. Knife makers collected special rose-colored flint for their finest blades. The first potters learnt to make containers from clay, which was dried in the sun. Other baskets were woven from local grasses and reeds for a host of different tasks. The same skills were used to develop the first woven fabrics. To do this, they created perhaps the earliest piece of complex technology ever devised. They designed the first looms, still found in villages today. They developed a soft cloth from native flax and made linen. Households grew to take in extended families. Kitchens were separated from bedrooms, and the need for privacy was growing.
The architecture goes way beyond what you need just for simple shelter. People are using architecture just like modern architects use architecture. In the interior of their house, they're turning it into their little home.
The archaeologists puzzled over the function of these huge columns. They could not hold up a roof. The heights are different. They now believe these columns are an ancient ritual platform where the dead were exposed to vultures and the bones eaten clean. As the birds of the air ate away the flesh, the spirit could be set free. Here, for the first time, religion became a huge public drama.
these Mesolithic natives, the hunters and gatherers whose ancestors had been living there since the Ice Age, were probably there in much greater numbers.
The hunter-gatherers living here never found grains which could be farmed, or the right herd animals to domesticate. The shift to farming just hadn't been possible.
One of the traps we have to avoid, I think, is that we shouldn't think that people back in those times were dumber, not so bright, not so intelligent. So far as we know, they had brains exactly like ours. And if they survived in the conditions in which they lived, they were probably a lot smarter on their feet than most of us are today.
In the Fertile Crescent, the old way of life was in crisis. Over 2,000 years, villagers had slowly changed the land.
Before villages got established, there was very little human impact on the environment at all. People were moving around. They didn't stay in one place for very long. They didn't have the opportunity to impact the environment. But now, as people are settled in one place, the impacts they do have can build on each other. And they can continue to affect the environment generation after generation after generation.
All the available wood grew on the nearby hills. Slowly, it became harder and harder to reach. Eventually, the supply could not keep up.
There is a deforestation that's radiating out away from the center of the settlement, and wood that should be renewable as a resource. But now we come into this problem with goats. One of the things that goats love are brush, and probably the sweetest brush there is a sapling or seedling. And so this is a irreversible deforestation. As long as you keep goats around there, those trees are never going to grow back.
For the first time, human communities were destroyed by environmental collapse, which they themselves had caused. In Europe, the advancing farmers were still trying to use methods from the Middle East. But this world was very different. As they moved north, they moved into a European climate. The seasons were much more extreme. Here, farming seemed to be impossible. For 1,000 years, they had no answer to winter. They could go no further. Finally, they succeeded, breaking through with a complete rethink of their farming methods. They realized that timing was critical and worked out exactly when to plant, how to grow and harvest before the winter. They learned how to use poorer soils.
So now farming is spreading to a whole range of soils which are not so productive, and therefore you need to clear more and more and more of the woodland in order to get the same sorts of yield from these poorer soils. And so the plough arrives as the solution to a problem.
With a plough, the farmers could cultivate much larger areas. It dug deeper to turn over these heavy northern soils. It was a new and uniquely European farming lifestyle. As they moved further north, the farmers found new groups of hunter-gatherers. They had plenty of food in a hard climate, where the farmers struggled. These northern people had studied their world for 5,000 years.
But as the farmers became predominant, so the remnant hunters must have melted away to join the farming populations. That was where the excitement was.
But the hunter-gatherers were creative and curious people. They too could work out how to adapt farming to their particular landscape. There's very little evidence that these two cultures clashed violently. Mostly, they taught each other. Ultimately, the decision was about food. The hunter-gatherers abandoned a life with the fear of hungry times for the secure harvests of settled farming. In fusing, farmer and hunter created the culture which started our Western way of life.
Salt is a commodity that is very, very costly. It's the white gold of prehistory. And at Rasool, you have the largest deposits of salt in the entire southern Levant, right on the doorstep.
The wasteland around Rasool ran down to the salt-rich waters of the Dead Sea. The beaches were already an ancient salt mine. Salt made possible the mass preserving of foods like olives and fish. Now, they could be traded hundreds of kilometres to new markets. With donkeys, they could send large, heavy loads to their partners as far away as Egypt and Mesopotamia.
Once you produce industrial quantities of goods, you have to keep track of them. For the first time, people aren't dealing with small amounts of material that they're producing within their household for use by their household. They're producing large numbers of goods.
Amazingly, they ran their whole economy with no money and no written numbers.
When you're trying to work out how these commodities are to be moved around and who is to get them, the beginning of record keeping is symbolic. For a measure of grain, you developed a small symbol. For a measure of sheep, you developed a symbol of sheep. These first tokens are small clay counters, if you will. And the earliest records, from what we can tell, are records of combinations of these tokens, kept together, slapped together in a ball of clay, and sealed with the stamp seal of one of the signifying authorities.
When the goods have been delivered, the contract is checked by cracking open the clay balls.
This is the precursor to the bureaucratic systems of later ages.
The invention of these tokens laid the very first tentative foundations for written language. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this way of life was a location. How did they survive in the middle of a desert?
Everything in the Middle East is about water.
The Rasoulians were extraordinary pioneers. Faced with a hostile environment, they did not surrender. Instead, they changed it. They built a whole network of irrigation channels, crafted to follow the slope of the hills. It was an enormous imaginative achievement.
These canals are many kilometres long. This is not something that 10 men and a dog do. This is something that hundreds, if not thousands, of people would have had to do.
For the first time ever, the Rasoulians brought everyone together on a single large project.
It's commonly thought that the pyramids are the first great evidence for complex society. But at Rasul, 2,000 years before the pyramids, we have clear evidence of organised society.
The system must have been controlled by local leaders, an elite of families enriched by trade. Thousands of workers had to be organised in a peaceful society. There's no evidence of armies or squads of slaves. So how did the leaders inspire the ordinary people to follow their plan?
In a nutshell, what we think goes on is that people are able to be mobilised by their leaders because they believe that the gods sanction it, the gods will it, indeed the gods demand it.
In the Wadi Hanan, in southern Jordan, green malachite was exposed by flash flooding in a riverbed. It's one of the sources of copper.
The thing that's fairly clear about malachite ore is that there was a lot of it around. In places like Wadi Faynan, it's one of the predominant rocks. Anyone that made a fireplace in Wadi Faynan out of the green rock was going to realise that this stuff melted at pretty low temperatures. And it wouldn't take them too long to know how to fashion this melted stone into a variety of forms. And better still, you could do it over and over again.
The miners were inspired by the colour. They ground it into beads for jewellery without smelting it. But they had customers from the other side of the Dead Sea who wanted huge quantities. These traders had a secret. The exact way of heating the ore to create something fabulous. By superheating with blowpipes, they created the first true smelted metal. Copper was used to make everything from ornaments to daggers. Not only that, it could be endlessly recast into other shapes.
We're actually finding copper objects abandoned, which is very strange. Copper crucibles and the nozzles of bellows, which show us that they're actually making those objects on that site.
Smelted copper was the first metal and very exotic. It was a prime trade item, and the prime traders were the Rasulians. They loved a chance to show off. And copper could be cast into such wonderful shapes. Rasul was one of the first great trading societies. The survivors took their skills outwards, showing how to live by trade rather than farming. It was a dazzling idea, which moved from the Middle East towards Europe. They came as traders and stayed to farm, building their own characteristic villages. What's more, they brought the art of smelting to the north. They added a vital secret from the Middle Eastern trading routes. Mix some tin to copper, and you get bronze. This process was so important, the smiths had the richest graves. They were probably clan chiefs.
At the beginning of the Bronze Age, you can imagine that much of the metalworking was actually undertaken by the chiefs themselves. And we now see this as a rather sort of banal task that should be undertaken by workmen or craftsmen, by sort of lower status people. But if you think of it as the magical transformation of one thing into another, then it's another way of showing off and demonstrating your power and your status and securing your role in society. Bronze Age consists in the introduction of edge weapons that you couldn't make effectively in stone, daggers that increasingly get longer and longer and become swords, spearheads that can be really effectively fixed on the end of a long pole. So the whole nature of armament was transformed by the introduction of a really effective working metal, bronze.
These weapons exude power. They are rare and dangerous. We are seeing the birth of a military elite with the power to get exactly what they want. Yet the weapons rarely show signs of use. Perhaps they were purely ceremonial. These leaders wore breastplates and decorative metal jewelry, again as symbols of their wealth. And they had another power symbol, the mounted horse. The pack animal was now being ridden. The owners towered over everyone else. They could move fast and cover huge distances. Horses were expensive to keep. A single horse eats more than a family. Only the elite could afford to keep them. This accumulation of symbols suggests they were preoccupied with power. They were developing a new kind of society with leaders and followers. The leaders dominated community life. Most farmers who produced life's basic necessities were the followers. This new social dynamic created its own momentum for change. With their new wealth, the elite families could support specialized crafts. They used materials like wood in more complex ways. And they learned how to use the most imaginative innovation of all, the wheel.
Well, archaeologists are always being asked, when was the wheel invented? And we can now give a rather precise answer that it was about 5,500 years ago that it spread. And these are very simple, solid wooden wheels, often turning along with the axle that must have made an amazing creaking sound as it moved slowly through the streets. So this is not a speed vehicle, but it is the first wheeled vehicle ever seen.
The farmers were running out of available land. There is evidence of boundary fences. Stockaded villages were beginning to appear. The last hunter-gatherers collided with the warriors. Their way of life disappeared forever. And then, around 3,000 years ago, there was a dramatic increase in the use of metals. The smiths discovered iron, which swept Europe. It revolutionized farming with cheap, effective tools. And it gave rise to great Iron Age civilizations. It loosed the sword and the soldier on the world. All of this was made possible by the first farmers.